the question of the moral and the moral status of embryos outside the womb that you have to look at under a microscope to see them is probably the hardest question to deal with when we talk about embryonic stem cells and using embryonic stem cells for treatment and research. Now, to be clear on this, and we tell our students all the time, please be specific when you say your moral assessment of stem cell research, because most stem cells that are harvested from sources other than human embryos are totally fine. They're in the clear morally, and there are hundreds of treatments that are in clinical use today that are being with stem cells that are derived from non-embryonic sources. Typically, we call those adult stem cells. The only stem cells where there's a moral issue are the ones derived from human embryos. And the reason there's a moral issue there is because harvesting the stem cells today necessarily involves killing the embryo. And so it's essentially a form of harvesting spare parts from another person that costs that person their life. Right? Now, the hard question is, what do you say to the idea that an embryo that takes a microscope to find it is still a person, right? And here's the answer to that. One is that we could put it in terms of Dr. Seuss, where he said a person's a person no matter how small. Or we could do it in a little more sophisticated way and say that our common sense views of a person require a continuity of personal identity throughout every phase of life. Okay, if you think about that, if we are nothing more than a collection of our physical parts and properties, then our notions of moral responsibility and criminal justice become a lot tougher to maintain. Think about if you committed a crime and you went into hiding, and 10 years from now you were discovered and brought to justice to face charges. You could plausibly, if we're nothing more than a collection of our parts and properties, you could plausibly make the argument that because all of your cells have recycled in that 7 to 10 year period, and you've lost other parts and properties during that time, you could plausibly make the argument that you were a different entity than the entity who committed that crime, and that bringing you to justice is actually trying the wrong person. Right? Now, you would thankfully, I think, get laughed out of most courtrooms, at least in the United States, and justifiably so, because our system of criminal justice and moral responsibility recognizes a continuity of identity through time and change. Philosophically, we refer to those things that have that continuity of identity as a substance that has an essence to it, an immaterial essence, as well as the physical stuff of which we are made. In Christian terms, we call that a soul that is embodied. Right? The soul, we would say, is that immaterial part that provides the continuity of identity through time and change in the body. Okay? Now, if that's true, and that what seems to follow from that is if we are nothing more than parts and properties, then our status as a person becomes what we call a degreed property. That is, it's something that you can have more or less of. And if it's connected to those critical functions that you perform as a person, all of which you have in more or less degrees, then that's something that can be thus degreed. And your right to life and your moral status would look something like on a bell curve, where for those of us that are on the opposite side, we're on the wrong side of that bell curve. That's not good news. It's also not good news for fetuses and embryos, who are definitely on the wrong side of that bell curve too. Now, if those things are true, then what seems to follow from that is that the only difference between an embryo in the lab, a fetus in the womb, a newborn outside the womb is simply location. And it doesn't really matter that the embryo in the lab is in a location that's not suitable for its growth, maturing, and flourishing. Right? If I sent you to the moon without an oxygen pack, I would be sending you to an environment that's not suitable for your flourishing, but we would say that's irrelevant to whether you're a person or not. So the environment that you're in just doesn't have any bearing on what kind of ontological or your state of being that you have as a person. So that's why I would say whether an embryo is in the lab or in the body or having given birth to it, they're all the same person along a maturing continuum. And therefore, harvesting stem cells from human embryos, I would argue, is an immoral practice, and no benefit to suffering patients justifies taking the life of a person in order to harvest spare parts. We would certainly not consider taking the heart of a 2-year-old if adults needed that.